Americans re-enter civic life. Coordinated national response. Well, we can't have that, can we? I mean, here's just one example from page 5 of this CDC document. Quote, travel patterns within and between jurisdictions will impact efforts to reduce community transmission of coronavirus. Coordination across state and local jurisdictions is critical, especially between jurisdictions with different mitigation needs, end quote. And that's easy to figure out, right? If you have an outbreak in one county or one state, you can't have 50 different containment plans across the country or across a state, not unless you are planning to hermetically seal certain counties or states. And so the CDC plan is very, very cautious about non-essential travel, whereas the White House guidance just says that if virus cases in your area have declined for a few weeks, travel at will. Quoting from today's AP report, quote, as of Tuesday, CDC's webpage on travel guidance during the pandemic still linked to the White House plan. The stricter guidance is not there. Now, the White House is clearly at odds with the CDC. It's buried the guidance that experts at CDC have been trying to get out to the public for a month now. But the CDC leadership may not be covering itself in glory either. Why hasn't this guidance been posted on the CDC's website? Why is the CDC director, Robert Redfield, dodging questions from senators like you heard on this today? What is going on at the CDC? Joining me now is the person who probably knows more about this other than anyone at the CDC, Jason Darren, reporter for the Associated Press, who's broken these scoops about why the White House is